Hi. Hi, everyone. This is Mashood from Core Data. Sorry, Mohammed couldn't join us for the webinar today. He's not feeling well, so I'm just filling in on his behalf. We have Sarah DeFrancisca from Dinsmore and Christopher Gingras from MedComply. Welcome, both of you. Nice to have you. I hand it over to Sarah to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mashoud. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah DeFrancisca. I'm a partner from Dinsmore and Scholl. And as Mashoud said, I'm also joined by Chris Gingras from MedComply. And today we're going to talk about medical device transparency reporting. As you guys know, we had a session a couple of weeks ago on the coordination between federal and state transparency. We have a couple of additional sessions coming up over the next few weeks. So the focus for today is on medical device. A couple of disclaimers. This is for informational purposes. We want this to be interactive, want to give you a chance to raise questions that you may have. Chris and I will address them from kind of our perspective, things we see going on in the industry, better practices, that type of thing. If others on the phone want to jump in and give their perspective, that's great as well. But just remember that you should really follow up with your attorney if you have a particular issue or problem, and make sure that you're getting appropriate legal advice from them. In addition, because we have multiple companies on the phone, just wanted to make it clear that we do intend this presentation to be in full compliance with antitrust laws. So we just want to make sure that we're not discussing any areas that are sensitive, like pricing, discounts, or customers or suppliers. Okay. So just by way of introduction, and we'll go through a couple of slides, just talk about a few things that are particularly relevant to medical device transparency reporting. Like I said, we want this to be interactive. Please ask your questions. So you will either be able to kind of raise your hand and ask directly, or you can feel free to use that chat box and enter the question in that chat box, and we will try to get to those. So while everyone is putting in their questions, a few things we wanted to mention. The scope of Sunshine Act has been expanded. So beginning January 1st of this year, applicable manufacturers are required to track payments and transfers of value to a broader group than just physicians. So it includes physician assistants, nurse practitioners, nurse anesthetists and anesthesiologists, clinical nurse specialists, and certified nurse midwives. In addition, we have some additional payment categories. So these include debt forgiveness, long-term medical supply or device loans, and acquisitions. And this was all implemented as a part of the Support Act. And again, this is for January 1st. So this information will be reported the first time in March of 2020. This is important because in addition to those changes, there's also a new requirement to add the primary device identifier for medical devices and medical supplies. So what we have heard from CMS so far is that you can reference the FDA Global Unique Device Identification Database Directory, and there's the website to that. We are hearing from CMS that they are going to continuously update that, and you will be able to use that information for annual reporting. It is currently updated through December 31st of 2020. I think they're rolling in additional updates as they come in. But so you will be using that to find the device identification for your device, and you will report both like the brand name of the device as well as its unique identification number. So Chris, do you want to cover the next couple of slides?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just turn on my webcam here. Hopefully I don't have the cat filter on in any way. That's always embarrassing. I just wanted to touch on kind of two things that are really unique to device companies that I see working with lots of device companies for transparency purposes. One of them is that depending on your business model, you are most likely using third-party distributors to market and sell your product. If this third-party distributor is making a transfer of value on behalf of the covered entity, that's reportable. So as an organization, you need to think about how do you go out to your third parties, make them aware of this requirement that they need to do this, and then collect the data. So the most typical example would relate to meals. A distributor is taking a doctor out for lunch or dinner to talk about the product. But in some cases, distributors are more sophisticated and they're organizing events, paying speaker fees. They're paying for travel for the doctor, like a speaker, or even attendees at these events. So these are all things that you're going to want to make a best faith effort to collect. In many cases, a distributor is working for multiple companies. They're selling multiple products in their bag. So these fees might be reported to a Stryker or a Medtronic. But if they are specifically talking about your product, you want to collect that data. And it's good to remind them throughout the year, every quarter. How do you make this easy for them as well? You can set up like a web portal to collect this info. Again, you're not going to get a lot of response, but I think you want to at least show that you've made a best faith effort to collect this data. And then I always recommend looking at your distributor agreement. There should be language in there regarding this responsibility as well. And then, as I mentioned, proactively communicate throughout the year. You don't want this to be a surprise, but like right now, you should be sending a notice to all your distributors asking them, hey, do you have any transfers of value that you need to report? Please let us know. Here's a template, here's a website that you can visit. Next slide, Sarah. And then the other item that I find is kind of unique to device companies is physician ownership. And this may not be applicable to all individuals on the call, but a lot of device companies do have physician ownership, especially if they're smaller or they're getting started. To conserve cash, maybe they pay doctors in options that the doctors didn't exercise, and now they're options. Now they're owners of the company. But if you do have any ownership, that needs to be reported, and it's the amount invested, the value of the investment in terms of ownership. And like maybe you acquired a company, and when you acquired that company, a physician owner came with it that you don't even know about. So it's definitely worth kind of doing some research and confirming, whether you do have physician ownership. And then, when you report this, you kind of need to think about this, right? Like, okay, I'm going to report this. Maybe you proactively communicate to the doctor that you're going to make this publicly available. In some cases, the value today is less than the amount invested a couple of years ago. So that's always kind of an awkward conversation to have, right? Like, hey, you put in $1 million, it's only worth 500 now with a doctor. So these are things just to think about, because you don't want them to be surprised when you report this. And the other thing too, and this is true for Sunshine in general, but especially for ownership, if they work for like an Emory or a Baylor or a large academic healthcare institution, their employment agreements could prohibit ownership in device companies or pharma companies. So again, it's good to make sure the doctors are aware that this is going to be publicly available. This shouldn't be new to them, but just something to kind of be mindful of as it relates to ownership. And then when it comes to ownership, any transaction made like a meal or consulting to an owner gets flagged in the system that it's related to an owner. So the government is really looking at, and they've kind of proven that there is some relationship between, hey, if a doctor has ownership in a med device company, they tend to use more of that product. And they've kind of proven that. And whether that's good or bad is up for debate, but the government really has a lot of concerns, and that's why they're trying to create these relationships between ownership and meals, consulting payments, and then also usage of the product. And then stock options is another one that it's an option. So they're not an owner yet, right, until they've exercised that. But if you are paying a consultant in options, which is very typical for, not typical, but not unusual for an early stage company trying to conserve cash, that gets reported as a general payment, and then instead of cash, you would just pick options as one of the as the type. So that would just be one of the drop-down options that you would pick. And then if you are paying in options, and again, this is not necessarily related to ownership and Sunshine, but you need to make sure that that's at a fair market value rate. So that's from a bigger compliance, engagement with healthcare professional. But I see a lot of device companies just pay ownership, provide options, and they've never figured out like what is that worth and how does that compute to time that the doctor's providing. So if you're providing over $10,000 in options and they're working 1 hour, that's not fair market value. So you need to kind of spend a little bit of time and calculate that. So that's kind of a high level overview of like ownership. And it's just a separate report that you would provide. But this is more, at least I find this more typical with like med device companies that they have to report ownership. So I don't know if you had any comments, Sarah, on like ownership or distributor, getting data from distributors.
Yeah, so getting the data from distributors, I think, is always tough. Companies really are struggling with that one. So I agree, having it in your contracts and having proactive discussions with them is really important. I also think it's important when you're doing diligence on the company before you actually sign on the dotted line to evaluate, do they have capabilities to track and report this information to you? Are they doing it for other companies? Are they being thoughtful about this, or is it something like completely not on their radar? And so you should not expect to have very good compliance. The other thing I would include in that contract for sure is audit rights, to be able to evaluate the information that they are providing to you. With regard to ownership, I think you hit the nail on the head, and these certainly aren't limited to medical device. These questions certainly come up with pharmaceutical and biotech companies as well, but I agree that medical device tends to have more ownership interests that need to be accounted for, and uses stock options as a compensation method in general. So this is an area that we get more questions on the medical device side. So these were great topics to cover. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so just a reminder, feel free to add in your own questions, things that you're thinking about or struggling with, and Chris and I will be happy to answer those. I don't see any yet. We have a couple of questions that have come in previously that we can go ahead and cover, but it'd be really great if everyone could add in their questions. We want to make sure that this is useful for all of you. So the first question, how do you choose the correct device identification number when a product line could have dozens or even hundreds of numbers? Chris, do you want to tackle that first, or you want me to go? You have any thoughts?
Yeah. So I think it's going to be picking the one that's most, at least in my experience, it's picking the one that's most representative of that product line. So if each screw could conceptually have its own unique ID, but maybe you pick the platform for that product. So that's kind of what I always recommend, to not make this too complicated. You don't need to calculate in Excel and do this modeling or anything. I think just pick the one that it best represents, and then have associated with it the marketed product name. So it takes a little bit of work, but again, I always caution about making this too complicated. You definitely don't want to have like hundreds of different options that you're picking. That's just going to become overwhelming.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think kind of documenting your rationale and using it consistently, so that from year to year you're consistent. And if you need to go back 5 years from now, or you're not around and someone else needs to figure out what you did 5 years ago, they have the ability to check that and be consistent from year to year. So I think yes, exactly right. If you're reasonable, have a reasonable process, and you document it, you're gonna do just fine on this reporting.
Yeah, and you can put that in your assumptions document. That'd be a great place to sort of document that. This number we picked and why. The government is really concerned that you're reporting the transactions, you're not going to go to jail for like not picking product A versus product B. Or pay fines. Hopefully, there's an interim step there. Yeah, it's going to be, did you report the transaction? But I think the assumptions document is the perfect place to put that.
Yeah, agree. Okay. Another question we have here, how do we report a payment or transfer of value that relates to more than one medical device? So this is a great question. If you have a meal with a physician and you're talking about 3 different products for the company, you want to include all of those. What the guidance from CMS is that you should include up to 5 products. If it relates to more than 5 products, I would, again, choose the 5 that are most relevant and document that decision. But that's how you want to approach it, is to track up to 5 that are most relevant, or report up to 5 that are most relevant. So, Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, 1 is the requirement. So not that you want to aim for the bare minimum, but sometimes just getting a sales rep to put a product in Concur is an accomplishment. So so I always try to, like, 1's required, so that's great. If a sales rep puts in more details, that's fantastic. But the 1 is always a good goal to get to.
Very true. Okay. So 3rd question, how do we accurately capture and report payments made to healthcare professionals on our behalf by third parties, such as distributors? So Chris, you talked about this, again, having that contract that lays everything out, communicating with them proactively, making sure that you diligence them beforehand, and having those audit rights, I think, are all helpful. Also educating your team on kind of these third party that they work with, and their obligations, so that they're aware that this is information that needs to be captured and reported, can also be helpful. So Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, so a lot of companies will have national sales meetings in January or February. So whenever I would do compliance training, that's a perfect time to communicate to the distributors the expectation to report, because the timing's perfect. It's January, February, I need to get this data. And then I've always found it successful to set up a simple website so that they can just go and submit the data, and you're not trying to get these emails. And it's really easy. You just set up a basic form. They give you the MPI, product date, just some real basic info, and then you're getting that. So I think those would just be 2 other tips to capture this info.
Yeah, that's great. I've also seen a couple of platforms where the distributors will submit it directly to your payment person who's handling your tracking and helping you prepare the report. So that also may be an option. So talk to your vendor there.
Yep. Yeah, and this also gets into a little bit of the, you want to know what transfers of value your distributors are making to healthcare professionals, because there's a lot of other compliance reasons behind that, because sometimes they don't know what the rules are, and then they're doing like marketing support for practices or all sorts of other things on your behalf. So there's a lot of other value in kind of really, like you said, Sarah, these audit rights. So you really want to know what they're doing when they're interacting with healthcare professionals.
Yes, especially if there's a problem with that data. You want to know that before you report it. Okay. And then I think the last question we have loaded here was, how do we accurately and capture report physician ownership and investment interests? So this one's a challenge. Chris, you just covered some of these, but certainly, having the conversation up front as to how this is going to be captured and reported, and working with your finance team or whomever might be the right contact to make sure that these are flagged and consistently reported from year to year. Now you're able to keep track of changes in ownership or investment interests over time. So Chris, I don't know if you have something to add there.
Yeah, no, I think it's just working with your finance team and being absolutely certain. Like I was just working with a client that, we don't have physician owners, and then they discovered they had one doctor that had 0.001% of the company from 5 years ago that they never even knew about. And it was just from an acquisition. And so sometimes you find these surprises once you start asking these questions. Hopefully it's not a surprise, but in this case it was, and they had never reported any of the data. The other thing I get asked occasionally is if I'm an orthopedic company and I have an OBGYN investing in the company, do I need to report that? And yes, it's a physician that's invested in your company. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in that specialty or therapeutic area that you're operating in. It could really be any physician. And then the other tricky part too is the family member. That gets complicated. Like sometimes you truly don't know if they're a family member of a doctor. And then is that something that you should be getting when you accept investment in the company? So I think that's a real tough one to answer. And if you truly don't know, then I mean, you're not going to do a survey of all your investors asking them if they're married to a doctor or something. But it would be good to get that up front if at all possible for reporting purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you meant acquisition, and that's obviously a change for 2021. Any tips on capturing acquisition costs and the reporting those?
I'm sorry, Sarah?
So you mentioned acquisitions, and there's the change for 2021 that acquisitions will now be a new payment category. So any tips on how to kind of accurately track and report acquisitions under that new provision?
I think it's just kind of working with your finance team to make sure you're capturing all of the details and being aware. The other item related to acquisitions as well, and I always caution clients to be mindful about taking on physician owners as well, because a lot of times acquirers are not so interested in acquiring a company that has physician ownership because of some of the risks that go with that. So you can't always help it, but if you can avoid physician ownership or stock options, that's preferable. I don't know if you had any specific tips on the new acquisition category, how to best capture that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be challenging for the during the acquisition process, during the diligence and the negotiations, making sure that if there is physician ownership, either if you're the acquiring party or the party who's being acquired, that there's a conversation or multiple conversations where this is kind of maintained on the radar, so that if the acquisition is finalized, that those ownership interests that are resolved through the acquisition, that those get appropriately reported. And we've had some instances where a company has been acquired and kind of like as their final report, this is something that has to be reflected and just tracked. So just want to keep it on everyone's radar as things are wrapping up. Oftentimes with an acquisition, you're so busy focusing on merging the business that you can lose sight of the acquisition. Things that should be reported might not be on the radar of the compliance team. So continue to work with finance, make sure finance is aware of that reporting obligation.
A follow-up question, Sarah, on acquisitions. So if a company is acquired, what would you recommend doing with that entity that's been acquired? So there's no reportable transactions any longer under that acquired entity. Do you recommend like deleting or terminating that entity in the CMS system so it doesn't look like it exists without any transactions under it?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think in some way documenting and demonstrating that this was an acquisition is not a failure to report, but instead we're reporting as a newly acquired company. I have seen kind of in the submissions where they have documented the fact that this was for an acquired party, and then going in and either deleting the previous profile or otherwise letting CMS know.
Okay. Yeah, no, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm kind of dealing with that right now with a client and just trying to think through, like, it is an interesting, like, you don't want CMS to see this entity out there that has no reportable transactions, because I think that kind of raises a red flag. And I see that with companies that like years ago, they set up all these entities just in case, and then they ended up never having any transactions. So all these entities exist. It's almost like a sunshine cleanup project to delete all your entities that you set up at one point that you've never reported any transactions under.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I don't see any questions that have come in. And give everyone another minute if you've got anything. But again, we have 2 more sessions coming up. I think the next one is on what to do if there is an issue that you find in your reporting. You have to address issues that are identified in connection with reporting. And then the 4th session is kind of a logistical discussion about using the technology for reporting. We'll have folks from Core Data on the phone with us to talk about any logistical concerns that you may have. So definitely keep those on your radar. You'll see lots of communications on those. But other than that, I think we're all set for today. Mashoud, thank you for hosting us. Chris, thank you very much for joining me. And you know, everyone, thanks for attending today. Hopefully we'll see you at the next 2 sessions.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Christopher. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day ahead. All right.